Please be seated. The court is now in session. Mr. Evidentiary, could you report the attendance of the parties and individuals to today's proceeding? Evidentiary, Mr. President, for today's proceeding, all parties to this case are present. As for Mr. Noon Chia, he is present in the holding cell downstairs. Based on the decision of the trial chamber, due to his health reason, the expert, that is Mr. Philip Short, is in the courtroom. Thank you. President, thank you, Mr. Perry. The floor is now given to the defense teams to put questions to these witnesses. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, Counsel. Good morning, Mr. Short. I'll be asking you some questions for the next 1 hour and a half. I wish it was one day and a half. Unfortunately, I cannot have more time. I do want to revisit a topic that we've been extensively discussing yesterday. And I'm doing that because it is an important subject in the first segment of this trial, and it is the killing, the alleged killing of Lone Nol officials and Lone Nol soldiers. Now, if you allow me to recap, if I understand your testimony of yesterday and the days before correctly, you have testified that there is a policy within the DK regime and before 1975 of executing Lone Nol officials and soldiers. You're saying there's no direct evidence to that, there's no documents, there are no insider witnesses saying specifically that. You deduct that from what you have called, if I remember correctly, a pattern of incidents of executions. Is it fair to say that that particular evidence is only or predominantly or mainly coming from witnesses who have testified or have said that they have seen such events, and not from Khmer Rouge cadres who were actually involved in the shooting itself?
Predominantly, that would be true, but there is evidence from Khmer Rouge or Khmer Rouge soldiers of that approach as well.
Could I find that particular evidence in your book?
You could. I'm thinking particularly, we keep coming back, but he's a very valuable source to Pipun, who fought, who took part in some of the first clashes in Ratanakiri in early 1968, and who said that was the policy towards enemy soldiers, and it was universally understood. I think one point I would wish to make here, you have dwelt at some length on the absence of documentary evidence. But we are dealing with a movement where political consciousness and imbuing yourself with a political line, and that political line was to have a clear demarcation line between the enemy and ourselves. It was to smash enemies. It was to show revolutionary vigilance at all times, to cut off your heart. that political consciousness was perfectly capable of creating a generalized understanding. It wasn't the Soviet Communist Party, it wasn't even the Chinese Communist Party, where two cultures where the written word was extremely important. It was the Khmer Communist Party, where much was passed on orally, and there was a premium on political consciousness, which certainly didn't exist in the Soviet Party, and to a much lesser extent in the Chinese Party.
Mr. Short, assuming for a second that you are right, and that if this was indeed a policy and that it was transmitted orally or it was understood, then I would like to put the following to you. You've been asked questions, I believe from the prosecutor, about the radio broadcast in which it was called upon to have the 7 super traitors being killed. Now, these broadcasts were very explicit about these 7 people, and I believe maybe there's evidence other people were added. Now, if oral transmitting of policy was very important, I could imagine that low-ranking cadres, even mid-level cadres, would have confusion as to what to do with low officials and soldiers. Because on the one hand, there's a very explicit message, 7 super traitors be killed. If you read the words, it is very implicit, or maybe sometimes explicitly, that others, therefore, should be left alone. So my question to you is, have you spoken to former Khmer Rouge cadres, or have you seen any evidence about possible confusion between the two? On the one hand, a public statement, particularly focusing on those 7 super traitors, and on the other hand, an apparent clandestine message to go further than that. Do you understand my question?
We are talking about messages destined for 2 different audiences. The Khmer Rouge soldiers did not listen to the radio station of the FUNK. They listened to their section leaders, higher up, their commanders. The message which you're referring to was addressed to the population of Phnom Penh, and as I said earlier, I think when we discussed this, it was very much double-edged. It said, yes, the 7 super traitors will be killed, and it then invited others to join the revolution, and said, if you join the revolution immediately was in that text, then you will be welcome and we will receive you with open arms. Well, the implication is, if you don't join the revolution immediately, you will be in the same category as the super traitors. It was not probably understood in that way by the urban population, but if you look at the text carefully, it certainly can convey that meaning. Within the Khmer Rouge forces themselves, and this is absolutely typical of the whole way that system operated, a system of secrecy, there are messages for ourselves which must not get out to the masses.
Don't mind me saying, Mr. Short, but there is, I believe, an element of speculation in there when you say that Khmer Rouge cadres, low rank, middle rank, or even high rank, were not listening to the FUNK radio. And maybe in other ways they were communicated the message that, the 7 super traitors, they had no chance, but others, if they joined the revolution, they would have chances. So one way or the other, those 2 apparent conflicting messages, one clandestine and one public, had to be reconciled by Khmer Rouge cadres. Wouldn't you agree?
I think you just used the word maybe which to me would suggest that you are speculating about this subject, just as you are suggesting I am speculating. I think I can say with some certainty that rank-and-file Khmer Rouge soldiers did not listen to the Funk radio. Their commanders may well have done so, but they had their own radio communications. The Funk radio was very much directed at the urban population.
I'll move on, Mr. Short, to a topic which we've also been covering yesterday, and it is the question whether in particularly the Northwest Zone there were what I would like to call rogue commanders doing things outside of policy or instructions. We were speaking yesterday about Ros Nim. I have been rereading your book again yesterday night after what you have been testifying yesterday. And if you allow me, I would like to read a few quotes from your book. And because they're all about the same subject, but they are various pages, for the context I would like to read them all after each other. Now I would like to start, Mr. Short, with what you have written on page 283. That is English ERN 00396491, French 0063980. And that's written by you the following: every rank and file soldier and village chief knew that insufficient vigilance against enemies would bring certain punishment, but excessive zeal in pursuing suspects would not. Thus, there was no central director from the party leadership ordering army cleanup squads in Phnom Penh and other towns to kill elderly and sick people who had stayed or been left behind during the evacuation. But the troops did so, because they had been told to ensure that the area was emptied, and that was the simplest way of doing it. There was no central directive either to loot libraries, scientific laboratories and research institutes, and to turn Buddhist and Western books, and to burn Buddhist and Western books. Nonetheless, it happened. That would be my first quote from your book. My second quote would be on page 282 of your book. That is English ERN 00396-490, French 00639820. It's you write there, CPK standing committee guidelines were transmitted orally to low-level officials, which meant that only the most simplistic, broad-brushed principles were retained. All the rest were improvisation. The way in which policies were carried out depended on the whim of the individual and the attitude of the higher-ups in his qua, a word you say which literally means string, but has a sense of vertical patronage network, through which a mandarin distributes largesse and receives support from subordinates. That's the second quote. The third quote you could find on page 320 of your book. That is English ERN 00396-528 and French 00639876. And there you write, and I quote, local leaders looked after their own. What happened in the next district, the next village, was not their concern. It made a mockery of central directives, as Paul was well aware. A little further, there was no established rule for the whole country. That's my third quote, Mr. Short. First quote in this respect, in this context, would be could be found on page 304. That is English 00396-512 and French 00639-848. There you write, and I quote, "In Phnom Penh, the different sectors of the city were guarded by units which, while normally under unified command, continued to answer to divisional commanders from different zones. Paul never succeeded in creating a military force which was loyal to him personally, and in the end that would prove his undoing." The fifth quote in this context, Mr. Short, you could find in your book on page 282, 283, English ERN 003 96490 till 91, and French 006 39820. There you write in your book, and I quote, "Khmer Rouge structure was such that zone secretaries in the role of provincial warlords were loyal to the CPK center, yet had considerable latitude of their own." And my last quote from your book, Mr. Short, if you allow me, that is on page 177 to 178, ERN 003 96378, and French 006 39685 until 86. And I quote from your book again, "The core of the insurgent force was composed of armed peasants from Khmer Viet Minh strongholds, led by old-style Isareks like Rosnim, Ko Pok, Mok, and Sopim, who had acquired their military skills in the war against the French. Only in the northeast were intellectuals like Sar, Ing Sari, and their followers directly in charge. Rosnim, Ne Saram, and K Pak had little time for the returned students. Sopim was quoted as saying disparagingly, 'Those intellectuals only have posh city homes and theory.'" These are many quotes, but I believe they are all, you can see them all in one context. When you think about these quotes in this same context, again, wouldn't it be possible that local cadres in the Northwest, maybe even with the knowledge of Rosnim, did those things, what they allegedly did in the Northwest, by themselves, without any central directive ordering them to do?
President, Mr. Expert, please wait the prosecution. You may proceed.
I am reluctant to break up my learned friend's questioning, but I'm compelled to do so because I think what he has done raises grounds for objections for two reasons. One is the quotes he has just read come from different periods of time. Some relate to the period immediately preceding the fall of Phnom Penh. Some are comments about the dynamics and functioning of the regime post-75. The last comment related to the period of 1968. It's not fair to the expert, and it does not represent an accurate representation or an accurate reflection of his book to be lumping together these quotes from different periods and seeking to produce a supposed fact out of them. I have no problem with my friend pursuing the line he's pursuing. It's proper for him to do so. But this lumping together of different periods spanning some 10 years, simply does not, will not elicit helpful evidence. And secondly, my second reason for my objection is that, again, this is repetitive questioning and it, in relation to the state of mind of Rosnim, and it invites the expert to speculate about the state of mind of one particular commander, a matter on which he's already said he's unable to provide further assistance.
Mr. President, if I may reply. About the invitation to speculation, I was hoping that my learned friend on the other side would give me some leeway, because I have been listening to his questioning, and that was a permanent invitation, like I said yesterday, to speculation. That is one. But the other one that is more fundamental, I think. This time period, 70, 75, 75, 79, before, that is a legal construct, with all respect. There's no such thing as a compartment in time of events. We have done so in this case. We're looking at the things that happened in 75, 79. But obviously, the struggle between Lone Wolf forces and Khmer Rouge was one continuing course of events. So to deconstruct it into very different periods is really not basically how history is being perceived by people.
President, the objection by the prosecution is invalid, although the question is related to different periods of time, but they are relevant and the expert is capable to respond to this question. For that reason, the objection by the prosecution is not sustained. Mr. Expert, please respond to the last question put to you by the Nuon Chia's defense. Thank you.
Yes, I must congratulate the defense counsel on having selected very skillfully a number of extracts from the book which go in the same sense, because it is completely true. There was a very, as I said, considerable latitude given to the different zones. But considerable latitude about how you carry out a policy on which there is broad agreement is one thing. To suggest that Ro Nim's forces in the northwest would have done things which were completely in violation of central policy is another. We do see across Cambodia, I would argue, a pattern of executions of the groups we've mentioned. Now, would Ro Nim and zone leaders in other areas have done that simply off their own bat if they knew that it was flying in the face of central policy? My answer is no. They had latitude about how they did it. The control was often very imperfect from the center, but they acted within a broad consensus of understanding. And the examples you gave, which are interesting, about books being destroyed, about laboratories being broken into and smashed, they were, if you like, regrettable collateral damage, but again, within the policy of violent opposition to city dwellers and all their works. I don't see that as evidence that rogue commanders would have taken into their own hands policies which were completely flying in the face of what was a general consensus.
Let me follow up on the last things that you were saying, Mr. Short. You agree again that there was no order, there was no policy to loot libraries or to destroy laboratories. Yet, as you said, it happened. Now, why wouldn't it be possible that Lon Nol officials or soldiers were executed without also there not being a policy to have that done.
I would go a little way down the road with you to the extent that I would say, yes, there were individual instances which we've described of libraries being looted, of laboratories being smashed, but there was not a countrywide policy of doing that. For example, the Cambodian archives, most of the material which was in them was preserved by the Khmer Rouge. It was not smashed, it was not burned. It was then pulped by the Heng Samrin regime, which needed paper in order to print newspapers. But it survived the Khmer Rouge period. The same is true of many Buddhist sites. They were not systematically destroyed. There were instances of such destruction. And if you are saying to me, is it possible that rogue commanders in certain cases, or rogue troops, killed people without any instructions, the answer, of course, is yes. But I would strongly argue that these were individual excesses, and that you cannot use that explanation to cover the pattern which we've been describing and which was consistent in Cambodia, which was a consensus for eliminating Lon Nol troops over a certain level and high officials.
Let's agree to disagree, Mr. Short. Of course, it is maybe up to the defense to argue if it wasn't a policy and it did happen, what was the reason, what could have been the reason for it. Now, yesterday we spoke a little bit about the possibility of revenge, and I was referring, as you might remember, to My Lai in 1968. Also on this subject, I went back to your book, and what I found was interesting, and that is the following. What you, of course, cannot know is that a week ago we were speaking to witnesses about the events allegedly that happened at the Tool Boat Tray, and the prosecutor showed footage from a documentary from Tet Sambat, and in it you could see a villager speaking about what he might have seen. And one of the things that he was describing was that the local commander of that fortress at Tulpo Tray, together with his deputy commander, were not only being killed, but both their heads were decapitated and were put on both sides of the fortress. And we have been wondering whether that could be acts of revenge. And by going through your book yesterday again, I saw a page with photos that you put in your book. And I would like to have, with your permission, Mr. President, to have that particular photo from your book on the screen. It is a photo which comes directly after page 129, and it is before 128, and it is before 129. It's, I'm not sure if everybody is having the right photo in front of him. It's a photo, actually with three photos. It's a page with three photos. And the biscript reads as follows. On Sihanouk's order, the army commander, Lon Nol, above left, organized public executions of captured Khmer, Sarai in the 1960s. In the civil war which followed, government troops took the heads of communist soldiers as trophies. Now you see the photo below, a Lon Nol soldiers, exactly with those two heads walking. And that reminded me of this story. And I was wondering if you could opine on the fact that there were practices of decapitating and then revenging that same decapitation.
I'm absolutely certain that happened. That there were acts of revenge, acts of blind violence. In the case of the Lon Nol soldiers, I think you may remember in my book I mentioned that one of the problems was when Lon Nol forces went into Ratanakiri, they started killing peasants and bringing the peasants' heads back in order to get the bounty, after which the Lon Nol command insisted on having a rifle as well as a head to prove it was a soldier who'd been killed. So these practices certainly existed. It would be very strange if similar things were not done by individual Khmer Rouge soldiers or small groups of soldiers. I would be, it's speculation, but I would be virtually certain that it must have happened. But that, again, is a little different from a nationwide pattern of behavior.
I would like to ask you some more questions on this topic, but I will move on, Mr. Short. And then I would like to stay with treatment of the Lon Nol government of other people. And I would like to turn to page 208 of your book. That is English ERN 00396408 and French ERN 00639725. On the bottom of page 208, you wrote as follows: over the next year, 250,000 Vietnamese residents of Cambodia were forced to abandon their homes and belongings, to be taken care of by their neighbors, as the government cynically put it, and placed it in concentration camps pending their expulsion. And still the violence did not stop. A little further on that page, you write, there was a price to be paid for this policy of hate. The South Vietnamese troops who had flooded across the border in April were ill-disciplined even in their own country. In Cambodia, they had a massacre of their compatriots to avenge. American forces pulled back as planned by late June. It goes on a little bit about what the South Vietnamese troops have been doing, but I'm actually mostly interested in the first part of the treatment of the 250,000 Vietnamese by the Lon Nol government. Could you expand a little bit on what, in your opinion, happened to the Vietnamese in that particular period?
These were Vietnamese residents of Cambodia, people who had spent, in many cases, many years, maybe all their lives in Cambodia. And after Sihanouk's overthrow, the Lon Nol regime launched quite deliberately a policy of racial pogroms, of hatred, inspired from the highest levels, which led to massacres and to a mass exodus of Vietnamese residents.
Would you be able to make a comparison between the treatment of Vietnamese in the period 70-75 versus the treatment of Vietnamese between 75 and 79?
Yes, they were pretty different. Lon Nol, and again, I mean, just for the record, I am aware of no documentary instructions coming down from the Lon Nol regime to the military to carry out massacres. But it was inspired from the top, and the massacres were carried out. To come to your question, after Pol Pot came to power, after the April the 17th, 1975, there was a movement to send Vietnamese residents back to Vietnam. And some Cambodians pure Khmers, managed to escape to Vietnam by passing themselves off as Vietnamese. So there were no massacres. that point. That came actually much later. By the violence against those Vietnamese who remained in Cambodia, began when the border clashes began, when there was a situation of war developing between Vietnam and Cambodia. But there was no systematic pogroms in the first year after Pol Pot came to power. They expelled them.
Now, following up on this answer, Mr. Short, you have used very briefly on Monday the G word, genocide. I will not ask you any legal questions, obviously, Your Honours, because whether genocide took place is indeed for the court to decide. However, on page 446 of your book, that is ERN number 00396662, in French 0064434, you say the following: the Khmer Rouge did not set out to exterminate a national, ethnic, racial or religious group, whether their own, the Vietnamese, the Chams, or any other. And somewhere else, I will refrain from that. You're very adamant in saying that, in your opinion, there was no such policy. Without using the G word, could you expand on what you meant?
It's very difficult to reply to that question without using that particular term. And I would quote George Orwell: there are times when the first duty of any honest man is to say that 2 and 2 make 4. Once the definition of a word, the ordinarily understood sense of a word, is deformed to fit a particular legal definition, then we are on very dangerous territory, because if words no longer mean what they say, we are entering a zone of unknown turbulence. So it is difficult. But I will say I'm absolutely convinced there was no attempt to exterminate any particular ethnic group. We are in a totally different situation in Cambodia to that in Rwanda, to that in Nazi Germany, where there was an attempt to exterminate Jews for what they were. They were Jews, therefore should be exterminated. Tutsis should be exterminated because they're Tutsis. That simply did not apply in democratic Kampuchea. The Chams are often cited as an example to prove that was the case, that there was an attempt to exterminate. But the difficulty for the Chams was that they had a very identifiable, deeply rooted culture, different from that of other Khmers, and Pol Pot's, as we discussed, the whole of the DK policy was to make everybody equal. So those who stood out were under greater pressure to be made equal, and in the case of the Chams, it happened by dispersing them through the country, by the very savage repression of their rebellions. But that is not the same as a conscious attempt to exterminate a racial group.
Thank you, Mr. Short. I would like to move on to a next topic. And that is a topic that revolves around a word that you have been using quite often in the last days, and that's the word paranoia. You have testified that paranoia became a self-fulfilling prophecy. It fueled the purges, I think were your words. Yet, in your book, you're also saying at one point that the DK leaders were rational men. And my question is the following, and I might be using some quotes, or maybe I'll just move on for speed's sake. Vietnam was perceived as an existential threat to Cambodia. Vietnam did, in fact, in '79, not only invade Cambodia, occupied it, looted its properties, took its rights. You're writing in your book. In your book, you quote a Russian ambassador warning the Vietnamese, please be more considerate, please be not as overtly expansionist. China, as you know very well, was very unhappy with the Vietnamese expansionist policy. So, wouldn't it be fair to say that the perceived threat or the threat was in fact real? The DK leadership was in fact thinking, and it turns out rightfully so, it was invaded in '79, that there were enemies both internal and external. And you're saying, and just to add a last point, you're saying in your book that it was not the case that the Vietnamese forces came to liberate Cambodia. It's not like they were really saving the people. You say somewhere they couldn't care less what was happening. They invaded because of their own interest. Now, summing that all up, isn't it true that you can't just dismiss everything, all decisions about purges, etc., as pure paranoia?
The President. Mr. Expert, please hold on. Mr. Prosecutor, you may proceed.
I must object, Your Honours. What my friend is doing is prefacing every question now with a brief speech which essentially amounts to him giving evidence, bringing together ideas or concepts, beliefs that he has with sort of paraphrased references to the book or the testimony, and then putting all of that together to the expert as a package. And just by way of an example, he said, as a matter of fact, that China was unhappy with Vietnam's expansionist policy. We've not heard anything on that during the last 3 days. In fact, there's nothing on that in the book in those very terms. And accuracy matters, details matter on issues like this. I'm perfectly happy with my friend putting these matters to the expert, but I want him to be precise. If he wishes to put a specific reference to a policy, then he should refer to the book or refer to other materials or refer to the expert's testimony. But for him to be bringing in his own knowledge or beliefs into these questions is just not appropriate.
Very well, Mr. President. I will read the parts from the book. I don't know why I have to do that, but I'll do it. It's on, starting, for instance, on page 409 of your book, Mr. Witness. That is ERN English 00396625, French 006399989. This is a quote about what happened after '79. Spring of 1979, Phnom Penh was systematically looted by Vietnamese, transferring goods back to Ho Chi Minh City. One page further, page 410, English ERN 00396626, French 00639989. Famine sets in and KR rice stockpiles and international food aid for Cambodia was diverted to Vietnam. Page 238 to 239, English ERN 0039643839, 8139, French 006399764. On that page 238, you write, even the Soviet ambassador in Hanoi, a pro-Vietnamese source, if ever there were one, told Moscow that the Vietnamese leaders still spoke of their old dream of a socialist in the Indo-Chinese Federation. On page 373 of your book, that is ERN numbers 00396-581, French 0063993, you write, ill-founded or not, Cambodian fears of Vietnam were real. After 2 years in which both sides had tried to avoid a collision, the Cambodians because they wanted time to make their regime stronger, the Vietnamese because they expected to achieve their ends by political means. And lastly, on that very same page, Cambodia's hostile, if not aggressive, behavior towards Vietnam and Thailand is not entirely irrational. Now, I think, except maybe for the Chinese policy, then I'll take that back. I have covered the quotes which I just summarized. Going back to my original question, paranoia versus real fear of being invaded. Please, could you comment?
You used the word rational, and I think you attributed to me a description of the Cambodian leaders as rational, the DK leaders. I would not go that far. I don't think that word is appropriate. They were intensely logical in many ways, but rationality implies taking into account all the different factors and making a judgment which is rounded. That they conspicuously failed to do. Now, you also amalgamated internal and external threats. You're absolutely right. They did have reason, and I've written it and I would repeat it, to fear Vietnam's long-term intentions. The Vietnamese nurtured a dream to dominate both Laos and Cambodia. It's a dream which has its origins some centuries ago, and did not want Cambodia to follow independent policies. But that is not the same to say that there is a threat of domination by Vietnam. First of all, it doesn't mean there is a threat of invasion. The invasion was brought about by the deteriorating relationship with Cambodia, for which the Cambodian leaders themselves ultimately were, to a considerable extent, responsible. An external threat does not necessarily mean that there are internal agents working for the external group, the Vietnamese, who have to be tracked down and purged. Pol Pot believed that, and he believed it from a very early stage. There are quotes where he said to the Standing Committee, we can deal with an external threat, but if it's backed by an internal threat, then that's a different matter. And there was this constant, I can only say paranoia, about being undermined from within, which he got from Stalin. It's in Stalin's brief history of the Soviet Communist Party that a fortress is most easily taken from within, referring to the communist leadership. So the two things are not mutually exclusive. External threat, yes, real. Internal threat, imagined.
Now, here I don't follow you, Mr. Short, because it was not the situation that Vietnam invaded and then went back. They closely cooperated with Khmer Rouge cadres like Heng Samrin, Hun Sen, Pen Sovan, etc. As a matter of fact, only a week ago, I've been reading this article from a German university professor in Berlin describing Stasi, the contents of Stasi files. And apparently the East German Stasi, in close cooperation with Vietnam, had records of people like Heng Samrin, etc. So there was a close connection between those former Eastern Zone cadres and the policy of Vietnam, wasn't there? You cannot see the one without the other.
Heng Samrin fled to Vietnam only after So Pum had been killed or committed suicide, and this immense purge, a purge so great that Duc said the people being sent into S-21, we can't even question them. Nguyen Chia says they've just got to be killed because there are too many of them to question. It was an enormous, unprecedented purge, and that was the moment when Heng Samrin fled. Others, including Hun Sen, left for their own reasons earlier, but there was no conspiracy in the East or anywhere else on behalf of Vietnam.
But he didn't just flee, Heng Samrin. He became the first president.
President, Mr. Expert, please wait the prosecution and you may proceed.
Now, I did give my friend some latitude with, again, another speech and a summary of unspecified articles. But again, I see absolutely no relevance to this last question unless we're in the business of pursuing conspiracy theories about how events post-79 impacted retroactively what happened before 1979. I think my friend is venturing into areas of completely irrelevant to the issues before us.
Now, that's the most interesting objection I've heard so far. We're talking about paranoia, and we're talking about purges. We're trying to find if there's a link between internal enemies and the external enemy, Vietnam. And my question was simply, didn't Heng Samrin not just flee, but become even president of Vietnam in 79? So I think my question is perfectly within the realm of the scope of this trial.
President, the objection and ground for the objection by the prosecution is valid. And so the question is, out of the facts put before this chamber, as well as the temporal jurisdiction of the ECCC, Mr. Expert, you are instructed not to respond to the last question put to you by the Defense Counsel. And Mr. Counsel, please move on to another question.
I will, Mr. President. It was a very touchy subject that I just apparently reached. Yes. The existential threat of Vietnam. We were just speaking about that, to the democratic Kampuchea regime. I would like to tie that in with the thing that we were speaking about yesterday, about ideology. My question to you would be the following. Isn't the existential threat of Vietnam to DK one of the key factors, maybe one of the most important factors, that things went wrong with the DK regime which, after all, in your words, had the most excellent motive. And that existential threat as a key factor, next to maybe factors like, I wrote them down here, the devastating results of the Civil War and the relentless US bombing, the DK victory in 75, which in essence came much too quickly, much too fast. The low, what you said yesterday, the low education level of local cadres, and also a word which you used yesterday, incompetence of the leaders. So the existential threat of Vietnam, plus those other key factors, weren't these factors in fact what made the revolution with the most excellent motive to fail?
I think all those factors, or at least many of the ones you have mentioned, were important. But they were not the fundamental reason for the failure of the revolution. The fundamental reason for the failure of the revolution was its single-mindedness. The fact that it was carried out without any consideration of the suffering that it engendered. Now, it was made much worse by the fact that it was done incompetently, that the cadres were not educated. And just as a footnote, we spoke yesterday about what the DK had learned from China, and one point I omitted, which is important, is the Chinese idea that it's much more important to be read than expert, that political will is much more important than technical qualifications, and that was a large part of the basis for employing poor peasants, often illiterate, to do jobs which they were incapable of doing because their class background was appropriate, but they didn't have the knowledge. So those factors certainly added in, and the pressure of a perceived threat from Vietnam, which with other policies could have been deflected, that added to the strains and the tensions. But fundamentally, the problem was what I've called the cruel, inhuman and abominable way in which good policies were put into effect and became not just bad but appalling.
One last question on the matter of ideology, maybe versus external factors. Yesterday, and I believe also the days before, you used the term slave state. I believe, and maybe I am wrong, but I think of the people that have been writing about the DK period, I think you are the only one who's actually using that term. But I was wondering if that word slave state maybe was you were inspired by Lenin, because I've been going through some writings of Lenin, and he has been saying in the following, and I quote, freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in ancient Greek republics, freedom from slave owners. Now, I'm not a communist myself, far from it, Mr. Short, but could it be argued that from the perspective of the peasants before 1975, the situations in which they were living could also be considered, along the words of Lenin, as a slave state?
I would agree with you that the condition of the poorest peasants in Cambodia before 1975 was pretty terrible. And that was the justification and the motive for the revolution, and it is a reproach to the governments, to the royal government, to the prince, and all those who ruled Cambodia before 75, that nothing was done to remedy that situation. That far I would go, but I wouldn't call it a slave state. It was a deeply unequal state. It was a feudal state. But it was not a slave state because even the poorest people had degrees of freedom which they did not enjoy after 1975. And I'm not using Lenin's definition of freedom from slave owners, and we could have a long discussion about that. I regard slavery as the absence of any freedom, and that was what happened after 75.
Now, isn't it here where we are, where two ideologies are clashing? The one ideology fighting for the faith of the peasants, and the other ideology fighting for freedom, other freedoms, which might not necessarily be important for a peasant. Anyway, maybe we should have this discussion at another time. I'll move on. And I'll move on, and I would like to discuss one last external factor which played an important role in the DK period, and that was the, as you called it, the low education of lower level cadres. Things that you hear all the time about this period, even people who have no idea, or have not really been reading anything about this period, always come up with the example that in that period you were not even allowed to wear glasses, and if you wore glasses, you were suspect. But I'm talking about this example as well because you're referring to it in your book. Do you agree with me that there was no such thing in the DK period as a standing order from the Central Committee? For instance, look at people who wear glasses because they might be intellectuals or they might be class enemies. Was there a standing order, thou shalt kill intellectuals? Thou shalt loot libraries, we've been speaking about that earlier. Or even, to mention another example, thou shalt kill people who steal fruits. In other words, wasn't there a big difference between the perspective of the top of the DK regime versus the way low-level cadres were executing it?
Not really, because if all your theoretical pronouncements, your ideological pronouncements, conveyed through Tongpadavat and other channels are that the regime is dedicated to destroying private property, which is defined in an extraordinarily broad sense, anything which is individual as against what is collective, then not allowing people to forage, to pick up fruit for themselves, it follows from that, it's forbidden. There is a consistency, allowing for variations, allowing for excesses. Everything follows from those central guidelines, that the individual, the hard shell of individualism must be smashed so that people can dissolve themselves in the organization with no individual personality.
But I still don't understand, and let's use the example of the glasses. How would the DK leadership incur responsibility for what a very local chief somewhere in the province is saying or thinking about people who wear glasses?
President, Mr. Expert, please wait. The prosecution, you may proceed.
I must object, Your Honours. My friend just asked a legal question. How would the senior leaders be responsible for the actions of lower-level cadre? That's a matter for Your Honours, not for the expert.
I didn't ask legally responsible. There's also another thing as being responsible. And please, Mr. President, don't forget I'm cross-examining here. I would like to have some leeway with asking my questions to the expert.
President, the objection and its ground is not valid. Mr. Expert, you are entitled to respond to the question put to you by Nguyen Chi's defense. Thank you.
I think there are two aspects to this issue. To take your specific question, no, there was no written instruction. I don't think in any sense it can be traced back to Mr. Nguyen Chi or to any of the other leaders. An instruction that people with glasses should be given trouble, killed or whatever. We know that in the Isarak period, people with glasses were also singled out. And my understanding from talking to Khmer Rouge cadres was this was something which came from the poor peasants, and that they regarded the rich and the educated as essentially the same. Having glasses was a mark of education. Both the rich and the educated looked down on them. Therefore, they were enemies. They were hostile. But having said that, it would have been within the realms of possibility for Nguyen Chi and the rest of the leadership, when they were perfectly well aware that this kind of thing happened, to circulate instructions saying this should not happen, and they did not do so.
Maybe they didn't know, but I was hoping you would make the reference to the Khmer Isarak, where the same practices could be seen as well. Isn't the fact that those practices happened in the 40s and the 50s an argument for the position that there is no correlation whatsoever between policy and the execution, for instance, about glasses? If it happened in the 40s and the 50s, why, if it happened in 75, 79, would it have any linkage with the policy of the DK?
Because it is the role of government to prohibit bad things and to ensure that the population is spared from crime and other bad things, as well as to promote good things. And one of the systematic failures of the DK regime was to prohibit unacceptable practices. The example of going for people with glasses is a very trivial one, but right across the board. Had they wished to do so, they could have insisted on other policies, and they didn't.
I see your point, Mr. Short, but this is 1975 Cambodia. There's no such thing as internet, probably no TV. and Nguyen Chi and others had, I'm sure, in those days, more important things to attend to. So, could you explain how they would be able to know what local practices were, for instance, about people wearing glasses?
Well, we're a little bit in the realm of speculation. My opinion is that Nguyen Chia and certainly the zone leaders, having been Isaraks themselves, would have been well aware of how the peasants tended to react. But I have not seen a telegram on that precise subject. But we know from all the telegrams in the Cambodian archives that the reporting from the provinces was very detailed. And there was a lot about misdeeds, things that were going wrong, things that were not being done correctly. The government, the leadership, had a fairly clear idea of what was happening. But, I mean, you said yourself, perhaps they thought other things were more important than maintaining law, order, a decent, safe environment for the population.
I'm watching the clock, Mr. Short, so I'll move on. I have a few issues to cover. One of them is a question earlier from the prosecution about S21. Reference was made to your book in which you have called S21 the pinnacle of the decay period. Yet, on the other hand, you are saying S21 was the same kind of institution that you couldn't find in any totalitarian state or dictatorship. You mentioned Argentina in your book. We were speaking about Algeria. Now, if S21 was the same kind of institution as in those countries, Soviet Union, China, Argentina, etc., why then, on the other hand, would S21 be the pinnacle of the decay period?
I think what I wrote was that similar institutions existed, and not in China. That was not true. They had a different system. In the Soviet Union, again, it was different, but Argentina, yes, the clearest comparison is certainly with what the French did in Algeria in the early 1960s, where there were institutions absolutely identical to S21, where people were tortured for information and then killed because they didn't, in order to get rid of them, in order that they wouldn't continue living and wouldn't be able to testify. So it was not unique, but in the French system, in Algeria, in Argentina, these institutions were not central to the system. They were not, you used the word pinnacle, they were, I won't say aberrations, but they were the dark side. I would argue that in DK, S21 and the district prisons run by the district chiefs, of whom some are still very highly placed in the Cambodian government, the people who sent prisoners to S21, that system was not a side issue. It was an essential part of the structure.
Maybe, but it doesn't make it the pinnacle. Pinnacle is the word which you use in your book. It's just, between brackets, a chain of security centers rather than the essence of what DK was all about.
S21 was at the apex of that incarceral system, and punishment, incarceration, the killing of those who were identified as opponents was central. It was the essence. We discussed this already. There was no judiciary. There was no other possibility of dealing with those who were seen to be opponents of the regime. Even in Argentina, there were courts. There was an alternative system. In France, of course, and in Algeria, there were courts. In DK, there were not. The fundaments of the system, in the sense in which that it protected itself against those it perceived to be opponents, was the network going down from S21. And that, I think, makes it fundamentally different from similar institutions elsewhere.
I would like to ask you more questions about that, but I'll move on, and then move on to what you might call the products of, for instance, S21, the confessions of the people that were interrogated and tortured there. In your book, you're using, sometimes quite extensively, those confessions to make a point or to prove something. However, on the other hand, in the same book, you're saying Pol Pot wasn't as dumb to rely too much on those confessions. And yesterday you were saying, you know, you had to be named at least 4 times, and at one point even 8 times. And this is a question to your methodology. How, when using confessions, did you reassure yourself you weren't using information that was completely untrue, wrong, etc.?
It's a good question. Yes, I did, because if you look at what I have quoted from confessions, they are little bits of factual detail. This meeting took place at this time, this group of people were there, which they are. I have used for the confessions only elements which I regarded as non-political. In other words, which were not extorted for political reasons and could not be put to political use.
That's in reality a very hard distinction to make. I mean, you have a piece of paper, how would you know?
But that is a job of a historian or a biographer, is to sort the wheat from the chaff.
I'll move on. Mr. Short to Nguyen Chia. You have testified earlier that, according to your opinion, he was not a member at any time of the military committee. Could you please elaborate on why why that is your opinion?
Because I have found his name appearing nowhere in documents relating to the military committee, or more generally to military matters. Yes, he was present at meetings which discussed the military situation with Vietnam, but his contribution was much more to do with the political implications and relationship. There is simply no evidence, if you like, to connect him. And if there's no evidence to connect him and no reason to think that he was part of any kind of military oversight structure, I tend to think he was not.
Wouldn't then follow from what you're saying that he also had nothing to do with policies about Lono soldiers or military?
Military matters are those matters concerned with deploying troops, with winning battles, with military strategy. What happens to defeated opponents is a political matter, and political matters were very much Mr. Nguyen Chia's field.
Maybe after 75, but not before 75. He wasn't in power. But you were saying also that before 75, all soldiers or military had to be executed, and that no prisoners of war were to be taken.
That is a highly political matter. You only have to look at China, where Mao laid down the political policy of trying to recruit enemy troops, trying to win them over and bring them into the revolutionary ranks. And that was basically how the communist armies in China developed and became stronger. What you do to defeated soldiers is not a military issue, it's political, at any point in a revolution.
I would like to follow up on that as well, but I won't. One other thing I'm interested in. You are aware that in 1979, the Vietnamese orchestrated a, what I call show trial against the Pol Pot Ieng Sary clique. Do you have an opinion as to why the Vietnamese, who knew quite well what was going on in the DK period, hardly ever, I don't think at all, mentioned Nguyen Chia and always referred to this trial as the Pol Pot Ieng Sary clique, whereas your testimony has been that, in fact, Nguyen Chia was the alter ego of Pol Pot and that they were both in charge. What is your opinion about why the Vietnamese did it the way they did it?
This is a very interesting subject, and we tend to give the Vietnamese much too much credit for knowledge about what was happening in DK after the mid-1960s, late 1960s. The proof of that is that, I forget the exact date, but at a certain point it was announced that Pol Pot was standing down as Prime Minister. Ieng Sary more or less disappeared from sight for a little while, and Nguyen Chia was appointed acting Prime Minister, at least that was what was publicly announced, and Le Duan said to the Soviet ambassador, Nguyen Chia is a good man, he's one of ours. The Vietnamese persisted in thinking that Nguyen Chia was sympathetic to Vietnam, because Nguyen Chia had studied undergone communist training in Vietnam in the early 50s. They regarded him as the most sympathetic of the DK, the CPK leadership, and they very conspicuously refrained from mentioning him at the time of that trial because they still had hopes that they could come to some kind of reconciliation with the Khmer Rouge through Nguyen Chia. It was completely mistaken, but that's what they thought.
Let me interrupt you because of the time. That might be, your point might be valid for the period pre-79. However, post-79, when the trial was being conducted, the show trial was being conducted, a vast number of DK cadres were became members of the Cambodian government. I won't mention his name again, you know who I'm talking about. And as a matter of fact, this person that I won't mention was, for years, the personal bodyguard of Nguyen Chia. Now, why wouldn't, with that knowledge, in that trial, the Vietnamese named specifically the clique, the Pol Pot Nguyen Chia clique, but insisted on calling it the Pol Pot Ieng Sary clique?
President, Mr. Expert, please wait to the prosecution. You may proceed.
Okay, Your Honours, I'm reluctant to intervene in the final stages of my friend's examination, and I let him get away with one question, but this is clearly irrelevant. How and why the Vietnamese labelled a particular trial or a particular regime in post-1979 period is completely irrelevant for present purposes.
I think the expert disagrees with the objection. Let me rephrase it. Wasn't it, in fact, the leadership of the DK, maybe the Pol Pot Ieng Sary, between brackets, clique, rather than what you're saying, Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia?
I understood the purpose of your question, and I'm afraid I can't agree. I think you mentioned that the individual who was Nguyen Chia's bodyguard and messenger from the 1960s, you say ought to have known more clearly his situation. I think you are underestimating the effectiveness of the secrecy with which the Khmer Rouge leaders cloaked their views. The Vietnamese certainly didn't know, when did they start to realize that Nguyen Chia was not actually their man, but was the alter ego of Pol Pot? I don't know. Probably very, very late on, long after 79.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Two last brief questions. Following up yesterday, that's about the period 70-75. You have testified saying the following, that that was about the shelling of Udon in 1974. You have testified that, according to you, psychological warfare was acceptable and that no attempt was made by the DK to avoid victims. What is the foundation, what is the basis for you saying that?
Well, if an army engages, we're seeing the same sort of thing with Bashar al-Assad in Syria at the moment. If an army engages in indiscriminate shelling of populated areas, civilian populated areas, I think it is fair to say that that army is attempting to intimidate. It is not paying very much attention to the human losses that result.
True, but then aren't you speculating if you do not know exactly what happened, where Lono soldiers were situated, what happened before, etc.? Isn't it too broad of a statement that civilian casualties were of no concern to the DK in that particular period?
I think it is a legitimate conclusion to draw in that, in those particular circumstances. They didn't need to shell. There was a tightening ring around Phnom Penh. They would have won anyway. Why shell? What could be the purpose of shelling? You may say this is speculation, but it is the job of historians to try to work out why things happen. It seems to me that the only explanation was to intimidate at the cost of shelling the civilian population.
One last question on that particular period. You mentioned earlier in response to questions of the prosecution that at one point in time, 72, 73, journalists got missing in Cambodia. And you were attaching conclusions to that it was sort of a start of killing foreigners, if I paraphrase you correctly. Now, how would you relate that to the things that happened in the days after 17 April 1975, when all foreigners were collected in the French embassy and were given a free pass to leave the country?
They're actually two different things. The foreign journalists who were taken prisoner by the Khmer Rouge were, in their mind, spies. And spies are killed in wartime. Spies are killed. In that war, they were. The Vietnamese took a totally different view. They recognized that whether spies or not, these people were foreigners and therefore had some bargaining value, and it was more intelligent to keep them alive and then to release them in return for certain concessions. So it became part of a negotiating process. It was much more black and white, as were most things in DK. Spies were killed, and the very few, and there were only 3 cases I know of who were not killed, were not killed because it was accepted by the higher leadership that they were not, in fact, spies.
But there is a different rationale between allegedly killing spies and foreigners. So you're saying the difference is that they were perceived as spies, correct?
They were perceived and therefore killed as spies, whereas the foreigners who were not killed, were not hurt, in Phnom Penh in 1975 were rounded up and put into the French embassy. And the regime, as you know, had at least one, probably two token foreigners who were part of it right the way through, who worked for it right the way through.
Thank you very much, Mr. Short. Like I said, I would need at least one and a half day more, but it's 10:30 with your leave. Mr. President, I will finish my question. Thank you very much.
President, thank you, Council. The time is appropriate for a short break. We will take a 20-minute break and return at 5 to 11. Court officer, could you assist the expert during the break and have him return to the courtroom at 5 to 11? The court is now adjourned.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោកឈរ